We welcome you back to this channel. In this video, we explore paranormal encounters in ghost towns, where our protagonists face the unknown in places forgotten by time. Spectral shadows and nighttime whispers await them. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The Detour.
My name is Emily, and although I still find it hard to believe what I experienced, I feel compelled to tell my story. It all began one summer afternoon after ending a long relationship when I decided to take a road trip. I needed to clear my mind, and a solitary journey seemed the best way to achieve that. I set off from my home in the north and headed south, with no fixed destination, simply enjoying the scenery and the freedom that only a road trip can offer. The route was quiet, and the sun was beginning to set when I saw a detour that wasn't on the map. A rusty sign read, "Whispering Pines 20 kilometers." My curiosity for new experiences was immediately piqued. A town with such a peculiar name? I decided I had nothing to lose by exploring it, thinking the worst that could happen was that it would be boring. The dirt road was narrow and winding, bordered by trees that seemed to lean toward the car as if trying to trap it. As I drove on, the sunlight diminished, and a thick fog began to form. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I continued, more out of stubbornness than genuine interest. After a few kilometers, I reached what seemed to be the entrance to the town. An aged sign, with barely legible letters, welcomed me to Whispering Pines. The place was enveloped in a sepulchral silence. There wasn't a soul in sight, nor the slightest sound. The houses were old, many of them in ruins, with broken windows and hanging doors. There was something in the atmosphere that made me feel uneasy, a kind of oppression that made it hard to breathe. I decided to get out of the car and explore on foot. I walked down the main street, observing the abandoned buildings. I wondered what had happened to the inhabitants. As I passed by one of the houses, I thought I saw a figure in a window. I stopped dead, my heart pounding. As I approached, the figure vanished. It couldn't be real, I thought. Maybe just a play of light and shadows. I continued my walk until I reached the central square. There was a dry fountain in the center and rotted wooden benches around it. The wind began to blow, carrying with it an inaudible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. I felt a growing panic, but something inside me told me I had to keep going. Suddenly, I saw movement in one of the nearby houses. I cautiously approached and noticed the door was ajar. I knocked on the door out of respect, but no one came out, so I pushed it open and entered. The interior was covered in dust and the air was heavy and stale. In the center of the room, there was a table with a lit candle, something impossible given the state of abandonment of the place. I approached and saw an open diary. The pages were yellowed but still legible. The diary belonged to a woman named Isabel, who described how the town had been prosperous until strange things began to happen. People disappeared without a trace, and those who remained started seeing shadows and hearing voices. Isabel wrote about a malevolent presence that haunted the town, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt. As I read, I clearly felt a presence behind me. I slowly turned and saw a tall, dark shadow in the doorway. It had no face, but its eyes were two black pits that seemed to absorb all the light. Fear paralyzed me, and in a reflex, I grabbed the candle from the table and threw it at the shadow. As I did this, the shadow vanished, but the whispers intensified, filling the room with a deafening echo. I ran out of the house and headed to the car, feeling something chasing me. I started the engine and sped out of the town. The fog lifted, and the dirt road returned to the main highway. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I spent the night in a motel, unable to sleep. The next day, I tried to find information about Whispering Pines, but there were no records of its existence. It was as if the town had never been there. Since then, I've avoided detours on my trips, fearful of encountering that place lost in time. where whispers and shadows still haunt.
Whispers of a forgotten town.
I have always been skeptical about paranormal phenomena. I investigate the unknown as a profession, not out of belief. Accompanied by my team, we have explored the darkest and most forgotten corners of the world in search of answers. But no experience was as unsettling as the one we had a few years ago in the ghost town of Blackwood. Blackwood is a town forgotten by time, located in a remote valley in the mountains. According to records, its inhabitants mysteriously disappeared in the early 20th century. The few legends that circulated spoke of a curse, shadows, and voices whispering unspeakable secrets. Determined to document what was happening there, we set out one autumn morning, with the fog enveloping us throughout the journey. The entrance to the town was a narrow, winding road, flanked by gnarled trees covered in moss. As we crossed the threshold, the silence was immediate and absolute. The houses, of colonial architecture, were in ruins, with broken windows and hanging doors. The wind whispered through the cracks, creating a mournful chorus that made us all too nervous. We set up our equipment in what seemed to have been the central square. We placed night vision cameras, sound recorders, and motion sensors. As night fell, the atmosphere became denser, almost palpable. The darkness in Blackwood was different. It seemed to absorb the light from our flashlights, leaving everything in shadows. Hours passed with nothing happening until at midnight, a glacial cold invaded the square. The air became thick, and a feeling of heaviness crushed our chests. Suddenly, the recorders began to pick up unintelligible whispers, but clearly human. The cameras recorded shadows moving quickly, too quickly to be people. We decided to split into pairs to explore further. My partner, Emily, and I headed to the town's church, an imposing structure that stood in the middle of the desolation. Upon entering, a smell of mold and rot hit us. The pews were covered in dust and cobwebs, and on the altar, a dark figure seemed to be watching us. While we were checking the interior, the sound of a whisper made us freeze. "Leave, before it's too late," said a broken voice. Emily pointed her flashlight at the altar and we saw it. It was a man, or what seemed like one. His face was a mask of horror, with empty eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. His body was mangled, as if it had been torn by invisible claws. We backed away, but the door slammed shut, trapping us. The figure floated toward us, just a few inches off the ground. Its lifeless eyes bore into ours, and we felt a cold that penetrated to the bone. Emily screamed, and instantly the figure vanished, leaving behind a sepulchral silence. We managed to get out of the church and ran back to the square, where we found the others. Their faces reflected the same terror we felt. One of our companions, David, had been chased by something he couldn't see. We decided to leave, but when we reached the entrance of the town, the road had disappeared. The fog had become so dense that we couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. We were trapped. We decided to wait until the next day, since leaving at that moment could cause an accident due to the poor visibility. We stayed up all night, watching every corner. At dawn, the fog dissipated enough to allow us to see the road. Without wasting time, we packed our equipment and hurried out of Blackwood. As we crossed the threshold, the air felt lighter, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. Once in our studio, we reviewed the cameras and audio recorders we had placed around the town, but to our surprise, nothing had been recorded. However, the memory of what we had experienced that night would accompany us for the rest of our lives. The shadows of Blackwood followed us, appearing in our dreams and in the dark corners of our houses. I still hear the whispers on stormy nights, reminding me that some places should remain forgotten. Blackwood was not just an abandoned town. It was a reminder that there are mysteries that should not be investigated. Next time the wind whispers your name in the darkness, remember our story and stay away from places forgotten by time.
Shadows and silences.
Some time ago, I ended up in Grim Hollow by mistake. My original plan was to visit my grandparents' house in a small town to the north, but a poorly marked detour led me down a secondary road. The sun was already setting, painting the sky a bloody red when I finally realized I wasn't where I was supposed to be. The place looked like something out of an old postcard. The houses, made of wood and stone, were deteriorated, with broken windows and dilapidated doors. It seemed like time had stopped in this forgotten corner of the world. I decided to stop in a small square to check the map and my phone, but both were useless. There was no signal, and my phone's battery was about to die. I got out of my car, and as I walked through the square, I noticed there wasn't a single soul in sight. Everything was immersed in an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of dry leaves under my feet and the whisper of the wind slipping through the abandoned structures. A rusty sign hung crookedly from a dead streetlight. "Welcome to Grim Hollow." The shops and houses around me looked as if they had been abandoned suddenly. Display windows held faded products, tables were still set with dishes, and old cars were parked along the street, covered in a thick layer of dust. Something felt off about this place. A sensation of being watched crept up my spine, and I decided not to stay longer than necessary. I found an old tavern, and hoping to find some clue or a map, I pushed the door open and entered. The wood creaked under my weight, and a smell of mold and decay hit me. Shadows danced in the corners, cast by the dying light from outside. At the back, behind the bar, there was an old portrait of a man with a severe face and piercing eyes that seemed to follow me. As I was inspecting the dusty shelves, I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it became clearer. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The whisper continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Fear gripped me, and I ran out of the tavern, stumbling over a chair and almost falling to the floor. Back in the square, I stopped to catch my breath and decided to look for any sign of life or an exit. My steps led me to a small ruined school with its doors wide open and the interior shrouded in shadows. An inexplicable force pushed me to enter. The inside of the school was even more unsettling than the rest of the town. The classroom desks were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the rest of the structure was now in decay. However, what disturbed me the most were the spectral figures that began to materialize around me. They were barely perceptible shadows, human forms moving slowly, whispering to each other in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figures approached, their faces gaunt and eyes empty. I felt an icy chill on my skin when one of them reached out a hand towards me. I closed my eyes tightly, paralyzed with fear. I heard a distant whisper saying, "You shouldn't have come here. You must leave before it's too late. Not everyone who arrives here can leave." With great effort, I managed to move my legs and ran towards the exit of the school. Outside, night had fallen completely, and the town was engulfed in almost total darkness. I ran without looking back, guided only by instinct. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to get away from there. The sensation of being pursued stayed with me until, somehow, I found my way back to my car. I never looked back, and I never spoke of that place to anyone. Sometime later, driven by curiosity and disbelief, I tried to find information about Grim Hollow. But it was in vain. There were no records, maps, or mentions of its existence, as if the town had never been there. But I knew the truth. I knew that somewhere trapped between time and oblivion, Grim Hollow existed. And with the town existed those shadows that I still remember and often see in my dreams. It was clear that there are inexplicable things lurking where we least expect them.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.